What I started to say, one factor sticks out in my mind is the fact that when Leon Slater was writing that book about the contributions of the American Machalniks and the like, he sought whoever he could find who he knew had participated in some aspect of Milchemet HaShichrur. And my dad had submitted a rather lengthy description, a long narrative, and the editor, who was it? Simon & Schuster? You would know better than I don't know. But the editor cut out the vast majority of what he wrote. And I don't know whether Dad embarked on this effort himself during his lifetime or whether I followed up, but we tracked down the publisher and we tried to get the original proofs. The original submission was long gone. It was trashed. It was in the dustbin of history, and it was gone, and it was irretrievable. But it emphasizes the importance of strike while the iron is hot. And when you have the opportunity to collect your information, do it. It's lahavdil with Shoah survivors. You got to get what you can while you got it, because in another generation there'll be even less to go by. So that's the story. And you want to ask me questions about 1947? I was a tot, barely 7.5 years old at the time, but there were certain events.
Well, why don't we
stick out in your mind.
All right. Why don't we get started, and then we'll get to that.
Yeah.
All right. I am Aryeh Halivni, sitting here with Avery Gross. It is January 18th, 2018, in the old city of Jerusalem. Why don't we start? Tell me a little bit about your family, where your family comes from. Where did you know your grandparents? Where they were from?
Yeah, I knew my grandparents. My mother's parents had come from Russia-Poland or some area in between. I think their immigration papers at Ellis Island reports them as having been of Russian origin, but I'm not sure, because geographical borders in those days were in a state of flux. But they were distinctly European. I did not have much communication with them, say. They were Yiddish speaking for the most part. And at the time they lived in Staten Island where I grew up. But my grandfather died when I was like 4 or 5 years old. My grandmother lived a little bit longer, moved with other children of hers to Nashville, Tennessee, and spent the rest of her life there. So I saw her very, very infrequently. And weren't very closely affiliated. My father's parents had a closer relationship. They lived closer to us. They both came from Hungary. My grandfather came from a shtetl called Niabata, which is identified on the map as being Satmarville. And his family were typical shtetl kind of people. My great-grandfather had a horse dealership, earned his parnassa selling horses. That was before Henry Ford's time. And my grandmother, my grandfather had whatever was par for the course for religious education those days. In his youth, he attended a cheder that was part of a reshet of the Chatam Sofer. One of his Rebbeim was a member of the Chatam Sofer's family, but he left Hungary when he was a teenager. He came to the States pretty much alone and earned his living in early days as a peddler, selling goods from a backpack. Ultimately established a little factory that grew a little bit bigger, manufactured mostly woolen goods. Later on in life, they became an importer and imported a lot of stuff from Japan after the Second World War. The story by itself not presently relevant. My grandmother came from Budapest. She came from a bit more sophisticated background. The big city dwellers considered themselves of a higher social echelon, and always heard the stories, the classical stories about the conflict, between the villagers and the city people, and they met in New York. They were both Hungarian, but they met in New York. They originally settled down in the Bronx. My grandmother had about 10 or 11 siblings, and her mother died young, and she wound up as being the caretaker. She raised them all, and she was a very capable woman. When grandfather established a glove factory, that's a story by itself. He was looking for an appropriate location to buy a little building to start a very small manufacturing outfit. And he wound up in Staten Island, of all places, because he was looking for a place where he could find a cheap building. That's what it was, economics that motivated him. And he found an appropriate building for his purposes, north end of Staten Island, where all the Staten Island population existed at that time. There were a few shuls that were all located within a mile of where today the Staten Island Ferry is located. The Jewish community developed there slowly, and Grandpa went out on the road, went out west. I guess Cleveland was about as far as west as they got in those days. And he marketed his goods. My grandmother ran the factory. She took care of the manufacturing end. And after they moved from the Bronx, it was one thing that bothered him, concerned him the most, that became apparent, was the fact that there was very little opportunity for any kind of chinuch whatsoever. So my grandfather arranged a small group of balabatim, and they agreed they were going to hire a malamed.
Did they have children yet?
Yeah, that was the motivation. They had children, had four children. The oldest two were girls, and girls never merited formal Jewish education in those days. It just wasn't on the agenda at all. But for his boys, he wanted. My father was the oldest of two boys.
When was your father born?
1914.
And his name was?
Reuben Eliezer, commonly known as Reuben, R-E-U-B-E-N, middle initial E. And it had to be when he was about 6 or 7 years old that invariably, if you look at the history of the development, all the day schools in America, all the yeshivot, they're started by people who have children that need education, so they become the prime forces that start the campaign and motivate. So my grandfather, he perceived a need to provide some kind of Yiddishkeit for his kids, and he got together a group of, just came across it not too long ago, I have a shtar in his broken English. He wrote out a one-page agreement that was signed. He's the top my grandfather, he's the top signature. It's dated in 1921, and a group of Jews in their own informal way, they agreed that they will contribute pro rata, depending on the number of children they had, to hire a melamed, that they would hire a Jew from the east side who would come to Staten Island, take the ferry. It was a trip. They would come a couple of days a week, 2-3 days a week, in the afternoon after public school, and he would provide classes for the kids. And I think I have the original someplace. I certainly have copies. It's the oldest extant document reflecting the establishment of Jewish education in Staten Island. And that's the way Yiddishkeit was in those days. It started out with several congregations, all closely together in the North Shore of Staten Island. They were all founded by Europeans as traditional B'nai Knesset. Over the course of generations, some of them became conservative, some of them became reform. There was our shul was the only one left. That was an Orthodox shul conducted by religious standards, but its population gradually moved away. Ultimately, the shul itself sold the building and had to move to another neighborhood. And the other neighborhood ultimately deteriorated too, and that's the story of the Golah. I wrote an essay about this a long time ago. But education on Staten Island it developed very slowly. In the beginning, it was a matter of chadarim, which basically meant after public school in the afternoon, after 3 p.m., they would have classes, whatever you could teach kids in an hour a day. And it was about the early 1950s. My dad took the initiative and pushed for the creation of a normative Torah Masorah day school in Staten Island. And that was the formal building. That was the formal beginning of real Jewish education in Staten Island. The rest, of course, is history. I grew up. To this day, my children laugh at me because they say I'm the most antisocial grandparent that they've ever known. I grew up as a loner. I was different from the others. I knew it. I sensed it. I just didn't relate. I didn't relate to my environment. I didn't relate to... I'd play a little bit with the kids on the block, but they weren't my kind of people. I sensed that I was of different stock. And from early on, we were, in the days before there was any form of day school education in Staten Island, we were shipped out to other locales for Jewish education. I remember when I was first couple of grades and went to a local Hebrew school at the community center, which didn't teach very much about Jewish religion, little basic Hebrew. By the time I got to third grade, they started a carpool. My dad had to go around knocking on doors and convincing people of the importance of Jewish education. Please consider it for your children. His real motive was to get together a group large enough to create a carpool. And they had half a dozen kids to fill up a car. They started pooling us to Elizabeth, New Jersey. And for my first few early years, we went to the JEC in Elizabeth, and the rest of that story you know about. later on, when I got a little bit older, I was able to travel myself. By the time I was in 6th grade, I was sent by public transportation. I spent a year at Yeshiva Flatbush. And between Yeshiva Flatbush and Camp Masad, I learned my basic Hebrew. I give them a lot of credit for giving me the foundations of what I know today. By the time I got to 7th grade, Dad decided that wasn't quite religious enough. He wasn't happy with the environment, and he switched me to RJJ. And my grandchildren can tell you the stories. The trips, you know, when my kids complain that the Hasa'ah doesn't stop right on the corner, I tell them how I had to travel to school with buses and trains and more buses and ferry boats and walking a mile to get to the bus stop. You know, it was the olden days when we knew how to rough it up.
Your father was growing up in the 1920s in Staten Island.
In Staten Island, yes. At one point, when he got to his later years of elementary school, maybe, or certainly high school, they sent him to MTJ, Mesifta Tzveret Yerushalayim, on the east side, 145 East Broadway. And he spent a few years there, and in high school he was at MTA, one of the early classes of MTA. I still have the yearbooks.
Was it called MTA then? Or?
No, because it was the only TA. There was no BTA to distinguish it. So there was one Talmudic Academy, and I don't know if Yeshiva University existed as yeshiva. Certainly not as a university, but it was a high school before it was a college, and before all the other schools got attached to it.
Was it already in Washington Heights?
No, I think it was originally downtown someplace. I think. Don't publish it as fact. But the dad also traveled to the city. It wasn't a bus; it was a trolley. They used to have streetcars, and yeah, he traveled too. One time I was late for yeshiva, and the Rebbe was asking, you know, what happened to Gross? Where is he this morning? And one of my classmates wanted to make excuses. He said, Rebbe, he must have missed the boat. So, boat? Was a fort from Philadelphia? No concept of what it meant. But I was a kid from outer space. You know, they knew I was a Staten Island kid. But
did your father talk about the Depression at all? What it was like? He was already in high school, I guess.
It was never talked about it that much. Never. That I don't recall at all. You know.
Okay.
I just remember my grandmother spoon feeding me and telling me there are hungry children in Europe. Don't waste it. That was always the line. I'm sure a lot of kids heard that. But no, it was not that much of
When he finished high school, did he go to college?
My dad, he did. I know he spoke of the debates he personally had with Dr. Revel, who wanted to convince him to stay in the yeshiva, and his parents were pushing him. You know, these were European immigrants who had to live the American dream, and at their encouragement, he spent 4 years of college at City College, CCNY. It was the only city college in those days, and he did fairly well. Got accepted to Harvard Law School, and ultimately both he and his younger brother got law degrees from Harvard, which was academically, I don't think it was as competitive as it is today, but considering the quotas and the kind of discrimination that existed in those days, it was a considerable accomplishment. They didn't accept that many Jews.
Around what year would that have been?
Well, I could get you more accurate information if I thought about it and checked some of the old yearbooks, but maybe around 1931 or thereabouts. No, actually, no. That was when he was still at yeshiva and college. If my memory serves correctly, he graduated Harvard Law School as part of the class of 1938. I think. I can check it out.
We have a disproportionate number of people that we've interviewed that went to Harvard Law School.
Mm-hmm.
Considering
Yeah.
Jews being able to go to Harvard Law
Yeah.
School, more than this is at least the third, maybe more, that have appeared where that was the case. Although the other two were younger than your father. Not a lot, but a little bit younger.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he went to Harvard Law School, graduated late 1930s,
Right.
1938,
Right.
and then what did he do?
What did he do? He tried to get a job. And every Monday morning, they want to know, where were you Saturday? Every Monday morning, the boss wanted to know, where were you on Saturday? He told him, I was in synagogue on Saturday. And that was the end of the job. He went through a few bad experiences with employers who would not tolerate any form of Sabbath observance. And
These are New York law firms?
yeah, new Manhattan law firms. And this was still in the throes of the Depression. Jobs were not easiest to come by, and the Jewish applicants were not the favored ones, especially the ones who insisted on Sabbath observance. And he told me stories how he had a couple little apartments in downtown Manhattan, and how he got evicted for non-payment of rent because he wasn't making enough to cover the rent. So he wound up coming to Staten Island for a short period. He lived in his parents' house in Staten Island. Rent was cheap. So
While he's still single?
May have been for a while, I think, because he was married in 1938. He was married in July 1938. And I have that documented because on the honeymoon, they came to Yerushalayim. And he would tell me about the Kotel HaMaravi in the pre-1948 era, you know. And the Arabs were no more friendly in those days than they are now, but there was no tzava then. They had to put up with the British overlords. Those were the days. But they spent a couple of months here in the summer of 38. And
Can you tell me let's take a step back then for a second. How did that come about? How did that come about that somebody who grew up in Staten Island gets married and decides that that's where they would like to go, that's where they'd like to go for his honeymoon?
I don't know. Nobody preached the theme in any of the schools he went to, that's for sure. You know, and again, I can say, I intimated before that growing up in Staten Island, you're very much isolated. And my dad had a reputation as being a free thinker, so to speak, that he did his own thing. He would do what was right. He fought so many legal battles that didn't make a dime out of it, but he was always fighting for the principles. He later on in life was associated with the Orthodox Union. He was vice president of some division for a number of years, but never really was on the same wavelength as many of his colleagues because he always thought independently. But he probably through the OU, and also he had a good relationship with the Goodest Israel and Moshe Sherel of Shalom, and he got involved in a little bit of their legal work. And you know, was Baruch Litvin from your town? His name doesn't mean anything with you. One of the early famous legal American battles over sanctity of the synagogue. He put out a whole book about his experience. I think it was some suburb of Cleveland. That it made legal history for those who follow these things, but it was a traditional synagogue that had been established by Europeans, and it had a charter that it defined it as according to the Polish rite, and they ultimately convinced the courts. I think it was in Ohio that a traditional Polish synagogue meant according to the Orthodox rite, and there was one fellow who was probably the only Shomer Shabbos guy left in the shul who fought the battle, and they won, and it made a whole book about it, and he helped them. He's given a lot of credit in the book, my dad, that is, and they wrote the briefs for it under the aegis of the Orthodox Union, lent the stamp to it. But, you know, and he was always a strong advocate in the Orthodox Union for education and for chinuch and fighting in the New York State Legislature for things which have just come about in the last couple of years, where they're providing significant financial assistance to parochial schools, largely with the help of the Catholics, of course. But that was a battle he fought early on, and wrote some of the briefs in support of equal treatment for religious institutions. But you talk about Eretz Israel, I don't...
Could they have known anyone that had I'm imagining somebody in those years probably didn't know very many people who had actually been.
Not in those years. No, I mean, there was a local Zionist organization that people, you know, you paid $5 a year for membership.
Was involved in that?
Whatever the program consisted of, you know, they had a speaker for the Jewish Agency come twice a year to speak to a group of people. Yeah, he was involved. He was always. I always saw his name on the letterheads as being an officer of it, but really didn't accomplish anything significant.
Did they take pictures of that trip?
I may have. Oh, was it? God bless Dad, was he a miserable photographer. Yeah. But I may have some somewhere. What I clipped out was they made a trip, and we have a local newspaper in Staten Island. It still exists, the Staten Island Advance. And there was a little box about this big that was published on the first page of the page about young marrieds travel to Palestine, or some kind of such thing. Saved it someplace in some scrapbook. But his main association, he tells the story himself. There's some recordings. There was somebody who did an oral history some years ago that did interviews like you're doing, not very intensive, but they were recordings, and many years later, my kid brother literally tripped across it by accident on some internet site, and he sent us all copies. He downloaded these recordings. It's not on my computer. I believe I can get it from my brother. He's a better saver of these things. But that's one of the few things that his own voice. He and his brother, who I don't know if in the pledge they mention anything about his brother, but he tells this. He tells some of the story of what occurred with his radio experiences on there.
So before we get to that, I just want to catch us up to that.
Okay. So what he tells, and I again, I can't be sure whether it's on those tapes or that I read it someplace, but basically his story was that he was drafted like all good able-bodied Americans were during the Second World War. It was towards the end of the war. The war, thank God, was winding down by that time, and he didn't get drafted till sometime in the middle or the latter part of 1943.
So he's already almost 30.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, makes sense. And he was sent for training mostly in Fort Benning, Georgia. That's where he did his basic training, and just like they do in all modern armies, they take a psychological profile, they interview them, they give them IQ tests, and they give them aptitude tests, and they decide, we think you're cut out for this. This is the section of the army, this is where you're going to function. So they said, Gross, we're sending you to radio school. So, courtesy of the United States Army, he became a sort of radio technician. His particular area of expertise was building antennas. Design, the theory, how to put them up, real old-fashioned looking things. This I do have pictures of, not from the United States Army, but from Tzahal, where he later served. He built some antennas, getting ahead of the story, but built some antennas in Beersheba when there was zero means of communications between the Southern Command and Tel Aviv headquarters, and they need a means to communicate. So they set up a little radio station. He built antennas for them down there. Anyhow, it was the Army. The whole story really begins in the United States Army, because it was courtesy of Uncle Sam that he developed his radio expertise. Towards the end of the very tail end of his Army experiences, I think it may have even been after the ceasefire in Europe.
Did he go overseas?
I think that for a short time he was shipped overseas, because I remember little things. They had a thing called V-mail. It was a crazy technology that they had during the war years, when civilians wanted to communicate with servicemen who were overseas, and the sheer volume of mail that people were sending was there were a couple of million Americans in service, and planes were limited in their capacity, and the government wanted to limit the freight, the sheer weight of all the mail that was going to Europe. They developed a microfiche kind of technology that you sent a letter, and I think they all had to be censored during the war years, but they actually photographed the letters. The letters had been handwritten, and these films, they didn't have an internet, but these little teeny little microfiche things, they packaged them up and they sent them all to Europe, and then they got printed. Because I remember I maybe even have some of the old letters from Second World War years that the family wrote to him on these things.
When were you born?
1940.
So you were already born when he was sent.
Oh yeah. I remember he had soft-boiled eggs for breakfast the morning he left. Sat at the kitchen table. I was all of 3.5. Things stick in your head. So, I had one other prized possession. I don't know what happened to it over the years. But they had recordings in those days, believe it or not. Little discs that looked like, if you remember the old 45 records, they're little discs, maybe smaller than that, on a floppy piece of micro something, that the servicemen, they could record a message and have it sent home. And I remember Dad being in the Army, and he recorded Kriyat Shema. And I recited it every night before I went to sleep, together with the record. Snippets from my youth. But he went to Europe, and the story he later told was that he had occasion during the course of that tour of duty to visit some of the DP camps in Europe. And it made an indelible, life-lasting impression when he saw the physical condition of the Sheret HaPleita, who were left over after the war. And it apparently instilled a feeling that he wanted to do something to help. He didn't know what. Came back to the States. Had to be sometime in or about 1946. Where he tells on one of these recordings, on his own initiative, he one day walked into the offices of the Jewish Agency on Park Avenue. And got an interview with somebody there, and basically told him, I want to help. What can I do? And they said, well, what do you know how to do? And he explained his background in communications and radios and the like. And one of the interviewers said, felt that it hit a responsive chord. He said, that's what we need. And because they did thorough background checks. I mean, certain things don't change, and they checked him out, his background, his capabilities, his reliability, and so forth. And apparently they felt that he was very, very appropriate for what they needed, because at the time, remember, the British were still here. And there was no free communication. Everything was censored. British censored everything. They knew that there were Jews that would do anything that they could possibly figure out to get themselves into Palestine. And the post office controlled the communications, a tradition that continued well over into the history of Medina Israel. And I mean, like, till not too long ago, the whole telephone system was through the door. But in those days, the British were the government, the British were the door, and the British were the secret service. And they wouldn't let a fly move in and out of the country that wasn't under their scrutiny and their approval. So the Jewish Agency and Haganah in those days, if they needed any foreign assistance, if they needed, whether it was raising money, whether it was smuggling arms, whatever it was, they had a lot of supporters in the diaspora whose assistance they vitally needed, and there was no means of communication, because any kind of communication, whether it would be by mail, which would take forever, of course, or even by telegraph or telephone, was all monitored by the British authorities. So they needed a method of communicating with sources that were beyond the ocean. And the ideal, of course, was, if you could somehow exploit radio waves. But radio waves are also controlled and regulated and monitored. And just like they do with the commercial stations, if you want to open up a commercial radio station, you need all kind of licenses and approvals, and they limited you to which frequencies and which bands, when, where, and how you can communicate. It was that way with the amateurs too. So they needed somebody with a sophisticated communications background, not only in the technology and the theory, but in the practical, hands-on. And from a operational standpoint, for any spy type operation, it's always ideal if you can find your spies who are integrated into the occupation, the trade, the society, the environment where you're trying to communicate with and from. And Dad, after he had learned the basics of the radio operations, first thing he did when he got out of the service, he applied and took the exam for an amateur radio license. And they're difficult exams that are administered by those days it was the American Radio Relay League, and then you had to get your formal license from the Federal Communications Commission. And he did this for a hobby. See, before he got involved with the Sochnut, this was his hobby. Everybody has a hobby. And he would spend, every evening he'd come home, he'd spend endless hours.
Where was he living?
In Staten Island. It's another story. There's stories within stories. So he would go into his Radio Shack, and he'd spend hours there communicating. Always boggled my mind of what interest it was for him to. They go on the open airwaves and they broadcast. They always have to identify themselves with the call letters that identify themselves, just like the commercial stations. This is WINS, this is WQXO, whatever. They all have call letters, and the call letters always identify the location from which you're broadcasting. And they would just go on the air, and there's IMW20XR, operating from Staten Island, New York. Hello, anybody out there? And they make total strangers. They make there's a certain camaraderie amongst people who were involved in the same hobby. And guy would get on there from the Netherlands or from Germany, from Australia, from South Africa, and he called back, and if they made contact, you heard my signal, I heard your signal. They'd chat for a few minutes, they'd compare the technical equipment, and after identifying themselves and discussing the weather, because you're not allowed by international regulations on the amateur stations to discuss any kind of commercial business whatsoever. It's going to be purely social talk. So there wasn't a whole lot that they could talk about. Obviously couldn't talk anything about politics or anything else, but and then at the conclusion, they get the addresses of each other, and they would trade these QSL cards. QSL cards were it was an imprinted postcard which identified you and your station. Sometimes it would have an insignia or maybe a picture. It was like a calling card, but it would give all the technical description of the equipment you were using and what your location was. And by the international amateur radio organizations, these cards were recognized as evidence of the fact that on this and this date, you'd fill in what date it was and the time in GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, was the universal code. At 1300 hours, I spoke to John, and located on the island of Gibraltar, and you would trade cards. And then you would collect these cards. Dad used to, I don't know what happened to him. My kid brother probably took them, but he had a pack of these cards, and he'd flip through them. It was like a travelogue. That you have all the pictures of all the places. You want these guys that have these cards identifying the communications. If you were successful in communicating and getting a confirmation card from every one of the 48 states, that's all there were in those days. You submitted them to the American Radio Relay League, and you got a certificate to hang on the wall. WAS, worked all states. So, the first 35, 40 was easy, and then you had to find somebody in Wyoming and somebody in Utah, and those are the hard guys to get. You have to stay up till the wee hours of the morning to try to find somebody in the sparsely populated. Then there was other contests, like there was one contest for working 100 different countries. He got his DXCC. He would from 100 different countries around the globe. So he was into this big time. That was his thing, And every night he'd come home, he'd spend a couple of hours talking to the world and collecting these cards. So getting back to Mashanagel, the point was that it was an ideal candidate because he could more readily disguise any detective work within the broader context of what was essentially his hobby. He had the equipment, he had the know-how, he had the ability, he had the motivation, but it was just applying a little bit different purpose. And in those days, you see, these radios had less power than an iPhone today, you know. In order to send a signal across the world, it needed more wattage than these humongous radios. And there were two basic ways of communicating. This is important to understand, that communicating by Morse code, the signal can travel further distances more effectively than by voice. And so when you really have to get a message through, so it's a long distance, it's always considered easier to do it by code. It takes a lot of training and it takes a lot of sophistication to do it at a reasonable speed. And it's, say, a little bit like typing. You know, that an accomplished typist can purr along at 20 or 30 words a minute, but it takes a lot of training till you get up to snuff, and you can do it accurately and speedily. And it's that way too. And so many times Dad wanted to send me for the license, but I could never get the code down yet. It needs a certain rhythm to it, a certain pattern. Maybe like playing a musical instrument. It just, you have a hush for it. Some people do, some people don't. And his younger brother, who was also into the hobby, but wasn't nearly as good. He prided himself on his abilities and everything, but when it came to this, he said, "No, Reuben, you're much better." And in the trade, they call you have a good fist. You know, you have the, it's like a surgeon. You know, some guy has the knack. You know, you can do it. He had a knack for this. So, and especially as regards this story, it was important to have that capacity. So so the Jewish agency felt that he would be an ideal candidate for what they wanted, and I guess some of the details he read in the book, but there's another article I came across that I photocopied years ago, and it had no byline, had no indication on the page as to where it was copied from. I have a suspicion that it was Jewish Life, because it was an Orthodox Union publication those days, and the format looks like it. It's the double column. It looks like it was copied from slick pages, the way they used to publish it in those days. And he was a frequent contributor to that in those days. But I can't be sure, but the information seems accurate, and I'll get your copy. If not today, I'll find it.
I don't really remember the book. I remember I read it at some point, but I don't really remember the story in the book.
Yeah, the story of the book is okay. It doesn't get as much into some of the technical details, which would likely bore a layman audience. But in a way, it's just, I think, to really understand what was going on, what the methodology was, you have to understand something about what do they call the science of codes, to really appreciate it. But this article explains it much better than the book does. And if you'll excuse me, I got to go to shoot with Tim for a minute. So this. As I mentioned to you previously, I was a little kid at the time. I really was not aware what they were up to. I didn't understand much of even what his hobby was about. But from my perspective, I know that was Dad's hobby. He spent endless hours in that Radio Shack. And
The Radio Shack was where?
it was part of the house. It was everything. What can I tell you? Everything's a story. I don't know whether he bought this house for this purpose, because it happened around the same time. I'd like to check, because the timing is very, very close. The house was ideally located for the purpose. This house was located, it was isolated. There were other houses around, but nothing really close to it. It was basically a post-war project developed by some government agency to provide housing when there was a housing shortage. And they found the most isolated hill in Staten Island that was cheap area, difficult to get access to, that nobody would have wanted to live there, but people who couldn't afford anything else, so they made these shikunim up there for these people. And it was one, on the tippy top of the hill, there was one private house that had been there since time immemorial. And the beauty of it was that it had a commanding view of the New York Bay. You know, it's from this house, you stand up there on top of the hill, you overlook the waterfront, and the extension was the Atlantic Ocean. And radio communications, certainly the state that it was in those days, depends on open exposure, that the radio waves travel best if you're not when you're in the middle of a big city. There are physical obstacles. It's like with a cell phone. You try to get reception. In this house, these walls that can be 1.5 meters thick will block the reception. Somebody comes here with a cell phone, got to send them outside to talk in the chatzer to get a signal out. Radio operators traditionally put their antennas on the highest point in town, so they get a broad exposure. And this house was located on the top of one of the, if not the highest hill on the northern coast of Staten Island, overlooking the New York Bay. And the house was separated from neighbors. You wouldn't have neighbors peering in on you, curiosity seekers, and you'd have your space. And in the yard, there was a big oak tree, like the classical oak trees in the novels, you know, that way up in the sky, and overtowered the house. And shortly after they moved there, my dad and his brother, they climbed up to the top of the tree, and they mounted a radio antenna way up on top of the tree. And now, my recollection, I wanted an opportunity to going? Okay, say that. What was I saying? I lose my train.
So they put it on top. They put the antenna
Oh,
on top of the tree.
They put the antenna on top of the tree. Every once in a while, another one of my children here grows up to the point where they get curious about their roots, and they want to know where the family came from. I take them back to Staten Island, and I have my own private heritage tour. You know, take them to the Beit Kvarot, take them to the Batei Knesiot, which are all churches now, and I show them the old town the way it was, and they all want to go see the location of where the radio station was, and I show them the big oak tree. So what's the point of talking about? The last time I went with my youngest child, tree died, it was cut down, wasn't there anymore. It was like a piece of my childhood was taken away. Someplace I have pictures, I think, I hope. Anyhow, I'm not sure if it was part of the motivation for buying that house in that isolated area, or it was just bashert that he happened to live there and it was ideally suited for it, but it worked out. In any event, back to the story and the Jewish agency. After they got done giving it after the Shabak thoroughly, or its predecessors.
Just 1 second, I just wait till are they leaving now, or just,
Yeah.
So he's got the house. He's gone to the Jewish agency to say that he
they,
wants to.
they check him out. He gets approval. He gets clearance, and they set him up. He had his own Radio Shack, but the transmitter that he was using could have been better. It needed improvement. The Jewish agency provided him with a transmitter. It was a big monstrosity that had been United States Army war surplus. After the war, they didn't need it. They sold off all the leftovers and the Sugbet radios they had. And what always blew my mind away, and still does, is that this all it was a radio that transmitted a signal. Not quite as powerful as your cell phone, but this was a radio that it sat on the floor. It was, like yay big, yay high. I never tried to pick it up, but to lift it, it had 4 handles. From 4 corners, it had a handle, and when it came in, when it came out, it needed 4 big husky guys, the kind you have on a moving truck, to pick it up and lift it. That's the way radios, it's made of steel and who knows what. And they moved it into the house, and it moved into his Radio Shack, and it sat on the floor. And some years later, we moved from that house, and the radio came with us, and ultimately, there's a Museum Tzahal in Tel Aviv, someplace. He donated it to them, and the Jewish agency they paid to ship it to Israel. They were supposed to put it on exhibit, but some museum curator decided that they didn't need it, they didn't want it, they didn't have room. Whatever it was, it disappeared, and we never saw it again. We came to Tel Aviv looking for it once, and nobody had any idea what we were talking about, but I knew it existed, and I knew they took it out of our house, and it was going on Aliyah. They're taking it to Israel, but it disappeared. But I have one exhibit for the whole. I didn't prepare, but I have one exhibit because I found an old photograph, and it's not dated. I used to take a lot of pictures, even when I was a little kid, but I don't know if this is mine. His brother may have taken this, but this was his Radio Shack. And what you see behind him here, that's the big transmitter, the BC610, and it was about as wide as it is high, and on the 4 corners it had these big handles, and you had to lift it up, and had all kinds of whistles and bells.
Just hold it.
Yeah.
Just a minute. Take it back a little bit. It's too close. Yeah.
See, in today's technology,
Oh, that's it. Thank you. Great. You got it.
So today, what they make in today's world, you know, they can pack the same amount of broadcasting power into a thumbnail, but back then that was in the Second World War. That was state of the art once upon a time, and that's what he broadcasted from, and that was his baby. And he had this. So we moved to this house on Franklin Avenue, which.
Wait, so what did he do? What did he have to do with this? What did the Jewish agency want him to do?
Okay, what they wanted to do, they had messages. There were secret messages, and it was conducted like a responsible spy organization, where there was a division of labor, and one chain of command never knew what was the content of the messages or who they were going to. They carefully, so the theory was if anybody gets caught, they're not going to have a whole lot to tell them. And just let me tell you about the Radio Shack. So this house was like one wing of, it was a little house, but it was one wing off to the side. It originally had been built as a sunroom. In later years, we put some heat in there, but it was a sunroom, and it had all windows. See, there was like 2 windows here, and 4 windows here, and 2 windows here, and on 3 sides it was windows, and the 4th side it was connected to the house. And I remember it being this way. And I never, till recently, recently gave any thought to why I always had these dark shades. All these shades, they may have been very dark green, or maybe they were black. I'm not sure, but they were very dark, and they were definitely light blockers, and the shades were always down. And they never let in the sunshine. It was always operating behind the closed shades, and I get it. There was a reason, but I didn't understand it at the time. So he tells in this, I don't know if it's in the book or in that article, but he tells how the people on the Israel side they did a lot of studying and of the science of secret codes, and they developed. When I was a kid, I was more interested in this stuff, and I read some preliminary books on codes. And certainly in those days, code breakers would always take the given text, the messages as they got them, and they would analyze the frequency in which certain symbols or certain letters would recur. If you would make this letter into that letter, they go analyze it, and by they know in the alphabet there's every letter occurs with a certain frequency. You take a Webster's dictionary and you analyze it, you'll find that there are more S's and T's in it than U's and X's, you know. So they have a statistical profile of the frequency, and they develop hypotheses based on frequency, placement, number of letters and words, and all kind of stuff like that. So they developed a code in which was all nonsense syllables that never repeated, to make it virtually impossible to analyze the frequency, and they embedded it all into 5-letter code groups. There was no such things as punctuation. There's no such thing as long words or short words, because there were units of 5 symbols representing 5 different nonsense letters. And they would do, and the key to decode this, there were two, in the whole world there were 2 of them. One was in New York and one was in Tel Aviv, and they could encode the message there and uncode it here, and that's the way it worked. So the messages were made up by one person, and then somebody else would be in charge of encoding it, and then it would be given to some shaliach who would have to transmit it. And all Dad really knew was it was part of the effort of the Jewish underground in Palestine. And there was a messenger that came to visit him. The article I read said that they came to the house. I have a recollection of it being at his office, which was also in Staten Island, not too far away. I don't know where it was, but there was a runner who was identified only by his first name. Maybe it was Tzvi, I don't remember. And he would come, give him these sealed envelopes, and sealed envelopes just have a lot of, I mean, it was nonsense syllables. It was just gibber. To anybody else, it was just gibberish. And the messenger himself had no clue what was going on. Wasn't supposed to know. And this had to be transmitted. It was transmitted by Morse code symbols, and it had to be exceedingly accurate. Because when, you know, if you got a letter that's faded with age, from context, you can figure out the things that are rubbed off or that have deteriorated. When it's nonsense syllables, it's like a mathematical formula. If you get a couple of digits wrong, you know, your experiment's going to blow up. You know, you got to know every letter. So it took hours, into the wee hours of the morning, several times a week. Yeah, you'd have to sit there and go letter by letter, and then they would repeat it as a double check. And the atmospheric conditions were not always ideal. Sometimes you couldn't hear so good. It was worse than having Rush by telephone. You know, it was sometimes the signal was just too weak, and you'd strain your ears and you couldn't hear it, and you have to ask the guy to repeat it. And it was very tense and strenuous experience. And so it worked both ways. He would get messages from his Palestinian compatriots that he would have to transmit, and then he would get messages back. You know, now your turn, and he would be copying down in longhand. You know, and again it was all in code. Didn't know what it was, but then the next morning, messenger would come back. He'd pick up the envelopes, and that's. The way it operated. One story he did say, so he was always, he couldn't help but be curious. He wanted to know, you know, but what's going on. It, you know, had to do with arrangements for arms and shipments, and where they were getting their neshek for the Haganah, and where they were raising money from. It was 2 main themes. It was money and tachmoshet. That's, you know, that's what it's all about. But he tells a story. There was one point that one thing he noticed was that the volume of the messages markedly increased. There was a higher volume. That's all you could tell. The messages were getting a lot longer than they had been for the previous several months, and he kept asking questions. And when I said, look, we can't tell you, but watch the newspapers. Keep your eyes open. And 2 weeks later, the Exodus story broke. And that apparently was part of the planning. But and again, it's been a lot of years since I've looked at the pledge. I don't know whether he tells the story, but I know in this article that I keep telling you about, I'm going to make a copy. And I know it's true because I remember hearing it firsthand. My dad used to speak to different Zionist groups. He'd tell them about his whole exploits in 47 and 48. And he describes how on a subsequent, maybe it was only because he was, the following year he was in Israel. He was doing Tikshoret for Tzahal. So he had occasion to meet some of the people who he had been communicating with, who he never really spoke to other than on the coded messages. And he met one of the fellows who was operating at the other end in Tel Aviv, and he gave him a guided tour of the location from which they operated, and he describes in detail how he takes them into a building, and they in the middle of a crowded, slummy area of Tel Aviv, and they go up a couple of flights, and then he follows them into a sherutim, and he locks the door behind them, and then he opens up a secret panel in the wall, and they crawl through to another room, and from another room to another room, and there's a connection between that building and the adjoining building, and ultimately he shows them how they set up their transmitting station in one building, but the way investigators will trace it is they look for radio signals. They have, even in those days, they had equipment, they can trace an unidentified radio signal, and then they can track it down from there. So they were concerned that the British might come looking for them, tracking down radio signals. So the wire led from this building through these secret passageways into another building down the street where the antenna was inconspicuously posted behind a different building. So if the investigators would come looking for them, they'd have enough advance notice to make a quick getaway before they'd have a chance to trace the operators. But the way he tells the story, and I remember him telling the story, and it's a dramatic afterlude to the whole story. But
was he concerned about what he was doing, that might get caught?
I was barely aware that, I had no clue exactly what he was transmitting, and it was a perfect cover for what he was doing because, hey, he was sitting there with his Morse code key. He could have been talking to Australia or New Zealand or any place else on the globe at any time. He just happened to be, I didn't interview everybody that came to his office to deliver a pack of papers. That was kind of normal for couriers to come with legal papers and packets. And
did anyone come snooping around?
I don't think anybody came snooping around. And the famous night, which I have a personal vivid recollection, is reported in that article as having been September 1, 1947. I wanted to check some collateral records, but I tend to believe that it's very accurate. It must be very accurate I know we had recently moved to that house. I wanted to check the date on the deed when we moved to the house. I was surprised that we were there as of that date. Apparently we were, because the FBI bust had definitely happened in the fall of 1947, and it could not have been earlier because the prior June I was still going to school at PS 46 at our prior residence. So I know we had to have moved sometime. I have a recollection we moved there in July of 47, and I was going to school already the following year from that location. But more important, it necessarily had to precede the Medina. So I know it couldn't have been earlier, it couldn't have been later. So fall of 47, and he was operating for quite a number of months at that location. And the reason, I remember subsequently explaining, was that if you know anything about the science of deciphering codes, what the investigators have to do is collect samples. You know, it's like they're chasing a criminal and they're not sure. A criminal has a repeating pattern. He's doing the same crime. So sometimes the police, they want to observe for a while, let him continue, and now we know what he's up to. We're going to keep we're going to follow him and get an idea exactly how he pulls it off. With codes, the more samples you have, the easier is the challenge of breaking the code. Especially when I don't know, today they have all kind of crazy computer programs that they do these things, but when the basic requirement is having volume, because you're looking for repeating patterns, you're going to do much better with a larger statistical sample. So apparently, the Federal Communications Commission, the formal investigators were the FBI. They were the law enforcement.
Tell me, I don't know any details. So tell me.
Yeah, okay. Well, these are the two arms of the federal government of the United States that were involved in this. The Federal Communications Commission is, as its name implies, they're responsible for communications. They issue all licenses for all forms of radio communication. Anything that's not hardwired. You have a cordless telephone, you got to get a license from the FCC to make sure that the wireless communications don't interfere with other forms of communication, and it's not going to cause interference with somebody's television reception, for example. And if there are violations of their strict regulations, they monitor these things and they identify the perpetrators, and they make the rules that you're governed by, what you're allowed to do on the airwaves, which frequencies just because you have a license, it doesn't mean you're free to broadcast anywhere you want, any more than a commercial station can just operate anywhere on the airways that they want. It's all defined. All that's controlled by this big agency called the Federal Communications Commission. The FBI, of course, those are the law enforcement folks. And in cases like this, they work together, because the FBI is largely lawyers and prosecutors, and they're collecting the evidence against the accused, and the FCC is the technical people that provide the details of mechanically and how it all works. So apparently, the reason they let the operation continue for several months and didn't clamp down as soon as they might have was simply because they wanted to collect the evidence. They just wanted to get more samples of what we're doing. And at some point they acknowledged that they they busted it up when they couldn't break the code, and that they had no idea where it was coming from, or where it was going to, or what its purpose was. And part of the methodology, besides the structured 5-letter code groups in which they were broadcasting, they adopted a strategy of adopting foreign call letters. Every station, you see, every country by international treaty has a series of call letters that it can allocate to their member stations, the licensees, and it's prefaced with a prefix. Like in the United States, every commercial radio station, if you have noticed, it begins with a W or a K. It used to be all W's. They ran out of combinations, so they started adopting K. So W or K is the station. They started with the old-fashioned radio stations with the...
Those west of the Mississippi, it's K, and east of the Mississippi, it's a W.
Is it? I don't know. I know, but I know for the amateurs, it also begins with a W, and then they started making with K, and they had W's all over the country. And then they subdivided the United States into about 10 zones. So if your call letters begin with W2, it means you come from the New York metropolitan area. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and surrounding states would be W2, and New England was the W1 stations. You're listening on the air, and you hear a signal W6 XYZ. So you know W6. Oh, he's from the Midwestern states. So this guy is a W7. Oh, he's from California. You know, and every area is identified by its call letters, by the prefix. Other countries have that too. I don't know what they do in Israel today. I'm out of it. But all the amateur radio operators, Israel was identified as 4x4. And every, Great Britain and France, every country that belongs to the United Nations, they will have a prefix which will identify the station, and it's muchayav. You have to identify yourself with that, and every 15 minutes that you're on the air, you have to have a station break, and you have to identify this is station, this is this. You have to identify yourself. So they wanted to throw the investigators, whether it was the British or the Americans, off the trail. And if it's a telephone conversation with a hard wire, you trace where the wire goes to. If it's radio waves that are up in the air, you can't always tell where they're coming from, where they're going to, especially if you're broadcasting from overseas. You're sending out a radio signal from New York in a generally eastern direction. But within that range, you can hit almost any place of the Middle East or Europe where it was. So they obviously didn't want to identify the signals as coming to and from Palestine. But they wanted something that was not too far away, so So the fella broadcasting from Israel broadcast with call letters which identified him as being from Greece. It's in the Mediterranean. If they detect a signal going in that general direction towards the Middle East, it could be Greece, but it wouldn't clearly identify it being to or from Israel. And it proved to be a strategic mistake. if you studied your world history once upon a time and you know what was occurring politically and geographically in the world in the aftermath of the Second World War, communist Russia was expanding its horizons. They were infiltrating Eastern Europe. They were pushing westward. They were trying to take over all over Europe. They had branches and undercover people throughout the periphery of the European countries bordering on the Soviet Union. Greece was one of their targets. The Russians were looking to communize Greece at the time. And therefore, Greece was suspect. When the federal investigators in the United States picked up some conspicuously unauthorized communications, and it was being directed towards Greece, it aroused suspicions that it may be part of an undercover communist plot to overthrow the government in Greece. And in retrospect, it turned out that that was their concern. Because when they found out ultimately that these signals were going to Palestine, they lost interest in the whole project. They never really followed up with it. They threatened an indictment, but they never really did it. And
So what happened on September 1st?
What happened on September 1st was that 3 federal agents rolled up in front of the house at about 9 o'clock at night in a big black sedan. And 3 gentlemen got out of the car, flashed some important-looking badges at the front door, and said, you know, we're from the FBI, we'd like to talk to you. And they invited Dad to come out into their car. He was swift enough to understand that these were, he knew what he was up to. He always knew in the back of his mind that someday something like this could happen. And here's some very official-looking guys, say from the FBI, and they've got this fancy-looking big black sedan, and they invite him to their car. He says to himself, damn it, that car's got to be wired, you know. I ain't going in there. So he says, no, I can't go out there. And he just says, no, you can come in. You're welcome to come in and, you know, sit down in my living room, which they ultimately, they didn't have an arrest warrant, so they couldn't force him to do it. So they had to hope that he would go for the bait. He didn't. He sat down. And early on in the conversation, they ask him his background, what do you do for a living? And they're talking to him, and you have to understand that his brother, my father's brother, Herman, younger brother, he was part of this to a limited extent. Herman was an exceedingly bright Phi Beta Kappa guy from Harvard, and he had the big time smarts in the family, and he was the technical brains behind a lot of this setup. Because Dad later explained, he said they weren't going to go to anybody for any outside help. What they were doing, you know, it had to be between themselves, and any technological problems they had to resolve it themselves and figure it out. And Herman was very, very helpful in that. I mean, he later got a license for the patent bar, and he was good in these things. He knew about radios, and he helped Dad build the antenna up in the tree, and he knew what was going on generally. But my dad was the guy who was the main contact with the Sochnut and the guy with the hands-on. And Dad, I mean, apparently knew something about, you know, how FBI agents operate. And it turned out that the night they came, as he later told the story, he happened to be on the phone, regular landline, talking to his brother. And he went to answer the door, he saw it was there. He did get a little bit shaken up, and he says to his brother, "Listen, I have some people who I have to talk to. Talk to you later." And very nervously hung up the phone. Uncle ain't stupid. He sensed that something unusual was happening. Several minutes later, they all sit down in the living room, and the FBI guys are talking to him. And apparently, classical investigative methodology, there was also a contingent that visited my uncle simultaneously. Obviously, they don't want you communicating, So I don't know whether it was my dad who was asked this question or her. They asked him some technical question about something, and he snidely remarked to tell me, he said, "You'll have to ask your buddies over at my brother's house." So they were spooked out. How did he figure that one out? I don't know. But it was conjecture, but he was right. They paid simultaneous visits. So they were over there. Look, appreciate that. I was barely 7.5 years old. I had no clue what they were talking about.
Do you remember this?
Yeah, I remember this. Yeah, I remember this. I remember this. That's why I'm telling you the story. I remember this. What I remember is I was shooed upstairs. It's past your bedtime. Go to sleep. I don't know. These were scary looking guys. I'd never seen people like this before. And they sounded very, very serious. And I was curious as hell to know what was going on in my little boy world. So it was a duplex little house. It had upstairs and downstairs. The living room, dining room, kitchen and the Radio Shack were downstairs, and all the bedrooms were upstairs. And I was shoot upstairs, and there was one flight of steps. And I remember sitting near the top step with my ear. I was trying to listen to what was going on. I had no clue to this day. I can't tell you what they were discussing. All I can is the impressions I had as a child. I was scared as hell. I hope they don't take my daddy away with them. And I don't know what this is about, but it sounded serious. And as hard as I tried, honestly, I didn't know what they were talking about. I was trying to eavesdrop, but probably wouldn't have understood what they were saying if I did hear them any better. Wish I could make up a story as to what they were discussing, but I don't know what they did. I don't know what it was all about. And they gave me a day. They said, "Look, I think they may have threatened that they could get a warrant for his arrest, but he agreed. He was an attorney. He was a respectable, honorable citizen. They let him go in his own recognizance, and they told him, but we want you to report to headquarters in Manhattan tomorrow or the next day." And they ended the interview. They pumped him for whatever information they could get. They didn't get very much because he really didn't know what the contents of the messages. That's the way the whole scenario was planned for, that's the way a spy network works, If they catch you, you don't have what to tell them. No matter what they do to you, you can't spill the beans. But apparently the one thing he did tell them that he was communicating with a friend in Palestine. Because they knew it was going overseas. They seemed to be espionage-oriented, these guys. So he'd hoped that would allay their fears somewhat, and you know, the way he later told the story, I wasn't, you know, I wasn't there to judge reactions, but he kind of had the feeling when he told them was Palestine that they believed it, and they were less aggressive than they had been initially. That yeah, what he was doing was illegal, and ultimately what happened was that there were never. I mean, he was very much afraid because he had a professional license that was at stake. You get convicted of a felony, there goes your professional law license. It was never indicted. He did go to Manhattan, and he got interviewed there. Didn't have a hell of a lot to tell him, other than the fact that they brought him these messages, and they wanted the codes. I don't know what they ever really found out, but they never pressed charges. But there was a violation of law, and the FCC in particular was very zealous about their prerogatives, being the enforcers of the communications laws, and they had to impose some kind of a penalty for this violation, and they threatened to revoke his license. You know, to someone who's this hobby is his lifeblood. You know, to threaten to take away his operator's license. That was a big deal. It was like, I don't know, they came and took away all my cameras. So he ultimately went to a hearing. It was a formal, it's an administrative hearing of the Federal Communications Commission, and because of the, and this I don't think is in any of the, I don't think it's in the book and any of the articles, but he tells the story on this recording that I'm going to try to get for you, that he had, because of the political sensitivity of it, the commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, he has the authority to delegate it. He has a number of hearing officers on his staff. In this case, he opted to handle the hearing himself. He wanted to be the hearing officer on it. His name was Sterling, Commissioner Sterling, and he conducted this formal hearing. And he was, on the one hand, he was a law and order guy, had to enforce the rules, but he was sympathetic. And I don't think we ever saw a formal transcript of that hearing. Dad tells about it in his own words on the recording, and he tells how he tried to explain that his motivation was the experiences of the Jewish people in recent years, and how he felt he had to do something to help them reestablish their homeland. And he quotes the commissioner in his concluding remarks. The commissioner noted that he was sympathetic. He understood in the course of human events, sometimes people have values that rise above the ordinary mundane concerns, and people sometimes, for idealistic reasons, are motivated to do things that they otherwise might not. And nevertheless, in his role as the enforcer of the communications regulations, he was compelled to impose a penalty, but he was taking all the circumstances. Into account, and bottom line, he imposed a 6-month sentence. It was like getting away in a coach. I mean, he could have thrown his whole radio associations down the drain, and he said, "Oh, 6 months, 6-month suspension. Can't operate for 6 months." So Ned was a bit frustrated. He describes how that night he went back to his radios and he turned it on. He heard the other guy transmitting, and he couldn't respond. And he describes, maybe it's written up somewhere, he describes how he felt like his friend was drowning. He couldn't send out the life preserver. So, besides the disappointment, it was very frustrating for him personally. So, what was he going to do? What was his experience and his know-how and his desire to help? So he went back to the Jewish agency and wanted to know what he had to do to join up with the Israel Defense Forces. So very shortly thereafter, he left his family, and he came to Israel. This is very early on, sometime in 1948, and again, they interviewed him and found out what he knew how to do. And he knew about radios, he knew about communications. And we all laugh about it generations later, but he was assigned to the Halivni. Now, my dad, he wouldn't know which end of the plane flew, but they didn't, he never saw the inside of a plane, that's for sure. And the whole Halivni consisted, maybe of half a dozen Piper Cubs. It wasn't very much to call Halivni, but they did have a need for communications. And he became part of the Southern Command. He was sent down to Beersheba, and the commanding officer there told him that they had no means. There was no lines to communicate from military headquarters in Tel Aviv to the Southern Command. They just had to operate on whatever portable radios they had, and needed something a little bit more substantial to have an ongoing communications. And they were in the middle of a war. There's no condition to start building telephone lines to Tel Aviv, and the radio was the only solution. So, someplace I have some pictures, somewhere. We used to have pictures he took of some of these primitive antennas that he designed and built in Beersheba. Looked like a bunch of boards and sticks with some wires strewn, but you had to measure them. You had to know how many meters long they would be and the distance between them. You had to know something about it. But basically, he built these antennas, and in its time, it did what had to be done. And that was his contribution to Tzahal.
How long did he stay?
Well, he left a pregnant wife, and he had to come back in 6 months for a baby. My little sister was born in March of 1949, so I know he was back by then.
Was he in Israel for founding of the state in May? Or was he...
I think he came shortly after.
Wow.
And that's where it was, and you know, I read so often, I speak to people who have been active in preserving the memories of the Holocaust, and one theme that repeats itself is that so often second-generation people regret that they didn't collect more information when they had the opportunity. They're kicking themselves that they didn't interview their elderly relatives who were survivors, and they didn't realize it till they were gone. And it was different. I'm in a different situation here. Thank God we were far away from Europe at the time. But also, I've often felt that, you know, if I had the hashkafa that I have today, and my dad were alive, I'd sit him down and tell me all about it. I'd take extensive notes. I'd take the recordings. Because I remember when I was a kid, you know, he'd get invited by a lot of local groups to tell his personal story from his perspective, and I would listen intently and hear a lot of these details. But whoever thought of recording it, taking notes? It's 70 years later, what I could have done, what I should have done. The way it is.
Fascinating. I've got a couple questions.
Yeah, sure.
Are you a lawyer also?
Yes.
Where'd you go to school?
I graduated college at Yeshiva University. That went to NYU Law School.
One of the questions that's come up we've been doing this new section now where we've been focusing on the American experience, the American contribution to that period. The common theme that we have among many of the stories is the ways that the Americans were involved basically required violations of the law to some extent or another.
Mm-hmm. I got to get you that recording with the Commissioner Sterling. He addresses the issue.
I'm just curious, and some people, like you said, what you said with the commissioner. I'm just curious, just trying to balance, especially a lawyer, who, you know, thinking about what they were doing, being aware, and yourself, you know, just curious what you think about it, and.
Dad was a very principled person, and ideals were important, and sometimes, especially when it's a matter of Hatzalah Nefashot and it's Am Yisrael, you know, you do what you got to do. There's a higher order to which you're responsible ultimately. You believe there's a superior din v'cheshbon someplace, somewhere. That, you have a dual loyalty.
What are the two loyalties?
I mean, you're a law-abiding citizen of the United States of America, especially if you're a professional who's sworn to uphold the Constitution etc., etc. מצד שני, you're Jewish. You're part of Am Yisrael. You're responsible to Elokei Yisrael. You got to do what you got to do.
How did growing up, knowing the story, impact you? And your family, I suppose, but how did that impact you?
It didn't interfere with our lifestyle that much, except my dad was absent for a period of time, but I kind of got used to that during the American War years, the daddies go away, they got to fight battles sometimes, and that's the way it is. To the extent that he participated in this, heck, that was his hobby.
How did it impact you, as you're growing up, you think about your own values, what's important, what's not important, what do we do, what don't we do. We often look to our parents as models for that kind of behavior. How did this impact on you in that sense of the risks that he took?
I'm sorry, but I got a.
Yeah. We often
hide the connection. Okay.
Watch the FBI.
We often look to our parents as models for behavior about values and what's appropriate, what's not. I'm just curious, growing up, having known this story, how this impacted you on what's important and.
Well, I don't know whether this particular story in general, but it's certainly part of the picture. But I was very close to my father. I was the closest one of 9 siblings, and we were close professionally, value-wise, religious-wise, practice, and hashkafa, attitudes towards Eretz Yisrael and the like. Certainly more so than any of my siblings. I worked out of the same office with my dad till the day he died. From the day I got out of law school, I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my professional license. I came back to Staten Island from being sworn in at the appellate division where they swore in new attorneys. And that day, I stopped by my dad's office and I found my name imprinted on the front window. I didn't ask for that, I didn't intend that, but it was always my father's dream, apparently, that, he'd have his son a lawyer and we'd be partners. And it was like, that's what you do, you grow up and you become apprentice. And so I went along with it. Because it was a start. Had no clear-cut ambitions beyond that. I thought it would be at least learn the basics and then I could go on. And I never left. I became his loyal assistant. Dad was always the idea man, the concept man. He'd lay it out and leave the details to me, and I would work out. I'd spend the long hours researching the legal authorities and the books and writing it up and filing the papers and doing the mechanical part. But I had a very, very, very strong allegiance to my dad. We were very close in every respect. And many people have said that I'm much of my father. I'm not sure I'm qualified to stand his shadow. My dad was a leader. he was able to organize a community which knew nothing from traditional values and to encourage them to support the construction of the first Jewish day school in Staten Island under Torah Masorah auspices. I never felt comfortable asking anybody for $10. Dad was good at that. He established an institution, you got to be a fundraiser. He was good at that. He assumed a leadership role in the Orthodox Union, and I never had aspirations like that. I was my own self. I wanted to concentrate on my own family. If I could raise my own children the way I wanted, Dayo. And that's what I've done. My whole life has been dedicated to my family, and certainly most of my adult years have been devoted to reestablishing my family in Eretz Israel and seeing that all my children grow up with a good balance of Haskalah and Torah. They're all Shomer Mitzvot, Shomer Shabbat, and all my boys have served in combat units, in Golani and Givati and Todchanim, and they made their contributions. They're all professionals today. They're working in their own professions, supporting their families. Baruch Hashem, I couldn't want more. And a lot of that influence is my father, no doubt. He himself made some abortive attempts at Aliyah for various personal reasons. It didn't quite work out, and he didn't live long enough to play out the script. But
When did he pass away?
78. And in a certain sense, helping to live out his dream. But it's the dream of Am Yisrael. This is where the future is at. I see too many of my more distant relatives in Chutz La'aretz getting assimilated and just genealogically disappearing from Toldot Am Yisrael. What's happening out there is no good, and I know it. And Baruch Hashem, my kids here know it. My own kids there, they know it too, but the message is a little bit slower in penetrating. But Bezrat Hashem.
Excellent.
That's my story.
That's fantastic. I ask you one question, just a name. If I'm curious if you've come across William Herlands. Does that name mean anything?
William B. Herlands was a federal judge of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yeah.
His personal life, his values, I don't know.
Anything. You just know him as a...
I know the name from the annals of the judicial reports. And,
Okay.
but he may have been an officer of some national Jewish organization at some point, from way back.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I know it from there too. Yeah, but that was an earlier generation. You
Okay.
got a connection there.
I'll tell you after. Thank you very much.